Oh yeah. Da tiri subject sumba tholam shendu zimbe lodo gabas.
Then now the third, refuting wrong views that there are other paths to liberation.
Da dame dobe sherab siba li tuje ge lamdo pa ten. Ane tela khaji gi zoba khare yongba te thamje pa pangje ranglu gi pa di drup. Da dene da ranglu gi khaji la pa danzi ma bang bar khar so gore. Tab shem dame ma gom ba tab shem ba ke yorwes. Tholam shen yorwes do khaji gi yores la yorwa. Di yoba yindu da di pa ga gi yore. Di yindu tholam shen du zimbe lodo ga wa se subject to sleep.
So up until now, the wisdom of selflessness having been first, it's shown to be the path to liberation. After having shown to be the path to liberation, the wisdom of selflessness being the path to liberation was further addressed by the various doubts that other doubts about why some people say it is not the path to liberation. So after showing that it is and addressing objections that it is not, that's what has happened up until now. And now, from here, the third, with refuting wrong ideas that there are other paths, is not talking about the wisdom of selflessness being a path or not, but this is another view that there are also other paths that may be viable paths to lead to liberation.
That subject to the Karislana, Danzi Mabang Bar, Dagiwala Chaji Misiba Tembas. Da Nimi Yinjang, Dala Chakwa Kunju Gomba, Tolam do Mite. Dagiwa Dunyan Gomba, Tolam do Mite. Rangshin the Kibu Tadi Shaba, Tolam do Mite. Wangchu Gikalunza, Tolam do Miron. Lelus Sebichidu, Dungan Zomba, Tolam do Miron was.
And so the 6 divisions of what these other paths to liberation are, it's divided or explained through 6 subdivisions. One is showing that it is impossible to remove attachment to mind without abandoning self-grasping. The inaccuracy of accepting a faultless self while considering meditating on the flaws of attachment to a self as a path for liberation. The inaccuracy of meditating on mind being the nature of suffering being a path for liberation. The inaccuracy of the knowledge of a person and nature being different as a path for liberation. The unsuitability of the mere instructions of Ishvara being a path for liberation, and the unsuitability of mortification as a means to exhaust the body and karma being a path for liberation. So now of these, the first one showing that it is impossible to remove attachment to mind without abandoning self-grasping.
Ta di khaze ngazu chakwa yang rimba sum ke je shede dala chakwa dagi wala chakwa yula chakwa se ta dala ale da dursi je khaze ngazu dala chakwa ani chorwa dewa la chakwa yula chakwa ke je yorwa ta thanda de dala chakwa dagi wala chakwa reswa dala chakwa dagi bi phungbo la chakwa ani yula chakwa ta dus sum yung gorwa o di indu ta yugi chakwa pangya thang chorwan dewa la chakwa pangya la sokwa ani lakor dini ya leba yena ani nga da nge se ji rimba thangbo nga che rimba niba de la nge se ge ani ngayu wa jimba ngayu bi phungbu sola chakwa di pangba la dala chakwa mabang bar ngayu wala chakwa pangwa di sigi mares ranglogi ta subject thangbo de thanda dir
tikima de la sorwa dewa di shego marwa rimba na la sorwa dewa mashana tiksara thanda
digir.
So over here, the order in which attachment arises, or that kind of sequence, was there's attachment to a self, then there's attachment to mind, and then there's attachment to things. And so of these 3, over here, what the opponent's view is, or what the opposing view is that of these three, to remove attachment to things and to remove attachment to mind, you don't need necessarily to remove self-grasping or attachment to the self. You can intervene at this next step, which is attachment to mind itself.
다 델라 자와 카레 녜버 달라 착바니 다기 라차 미첼신 녜메 달라 착바는 체위 규에 요마이스.
So the root is attached to a self. Definitely there can be no separation from attachment to mind. There cannot be separation from attachment to mind. There is also no cause of the absence of attachment for a self with no faults.
제바 녜버 달라 착바니 티시 다기 와라 착바다 미델신 다샤기 신유 다 녜바 메바 이나 달라 착바다 체위 규양 요바 마이노스.
The commentary is, as long as there is attachment to a self, there will definitely be no separation of attachment or from attachment to mind. If the conceived object of attachment to the self is a self with no faults, there can also be no cause for the absence of attachment to a self.
다 딜라 카장안주 슈벤네 신시제 달라 착바 세티 당진다 총딩 계절이바 당진도 총딩시.
So if you remember the other day, when we're talking about attachment to self over here, attachment to self is being explained as being concomitant with self-grasping.
다 총딩 임바 인두 당진 태다 달라 착원이기 신유디 찍루와 카가 요마르와 대유디 신유디 가리레 각지 다 들어와.
So if they are concomitant with each other, then conceived object, determined object, that you know the other word that we find is determined object, yeah? It's the one of that conceptual mind in the divisions of objects. Do you remember this one? Yeah. So because they are concomitant, attachment and self-grasping, attachment to the self and self-grasping, because they're concomitant, they'll also have to have the same determined object or the same conceived object, yeah? They don't have different objects.
So 다 딘디 인두 다샤기 신유 다데 녜바 메바 이나 세두 녜바 메바 세두 세메 녜바 메바 시고레 세메 녜바 메바 이나 아니 코카투예요 말다 리베 카투예요 말이.
And now when it says, if the conceived object of attachment to a self is a self with no faults, and here faults means it cannot be refuted by valid cognition. So there is no faulty perception of it. It is not refutable by valid cognition. So not having faults here means not being able to be refuted by valid cognition, which means that it exists. If the conceived object of attachment to a self is a self with no faults, which means a self that cannot be refuted by valid cognition, then it exists and therefore you cannot refute it. It can't be negated.
딘디 다디 세메 녜바 메바 인소나 아니 다디 리베 곰미투바셰 리베 곰부투는 코요르와 코요바이나 콜미네 다두 심빌로디 게디기르와 디인디 다두 짐빌로디 게디기르 다두 짐빌로디 게데나 코도 숭딩이 달라 차과디엔 게디기르 디인디 아니 달라 차과디 체 달라 차과 메버스웨게다 첼로아세나 심규 달라 차과다 체와 메버스웨디 다 융해요 말이에스 디인디 달라 착바다 체비 규양 요바 마이노스.
So if this object of self-grasping is a self which is faultless, then it exists. If it exists, then it cannot be refuted. If it can't be refuted, then there will always arise a mind that perceives this, and that perception will be self-grasping. And so then self-grasping will not be able to be removed. Along with that self-grasping, or the mind that conceives of a self, there will always be a concomitant attachment to that self. And so, as long as you have this, as long as the self exists, there will be self-grasping, and along with it, there will be attachment to the self, which will then necessarily lead to attachment to mind, and therefore, as long as the self is faultless or cannot be negated, the self will always be conceived of by a mind which will be self-grasping, which will have concomitant with it attachment, and therefore you cannot remove attachment to mind.
다 달라 착바다 다 제위 규심 달라 착바도 제위 규 여바 마인디 달라 착바도 제와 제토고 말해 달라 착바도 제와 지마도나 달라 착바 깨디기로 봐 달라 착바디 깨되나 아니 디 중도라 아니 다기와라 착바디 랑싱기 레디기레스.
And so if the self exists, then there is no cause for the absence of attachment to this self. And if there is no cause for the absence of attachment to this self, then as long as you will observe or conceive of this self, there will always be attachment to it, and subsequently it will always give rise to attachment to mind.
디인디 녀버 달라 차바니 다기 라차 미들싱 세 된다디레 디기 줍제데라 굼젠데라 가르친니 달라 차바 요나 다기 월라 차바디 팅 마레스 라바이나 마레 달라 차바디 요나 다기 월라 차바디 카팅 마레스 다 달라 차바디 컨디션에 카테요 마레스 라바이나 케란 쳬바이나 달라 차바디기 신인 다디 세메 네바 메바레도 와스 어디 두스 굼젠 두고라.
So that's why it says when there is attachment to a self, there definitely can be no separation from attachment to mind. And then why, if there is attachment to a self, does there have to be separation? Does there have to be attachment to mind? Because attachment to self naturally leads to attachment to mind. And then why can there be no absence of attachment or freedom from attachment to the self, which will then always lead to attachment to mind? Because you have accepted that the object of self-grasping or attachment to a self is a faultless self, which means that it cannot be refuted or negated by valid cognition. So it will naturally give rise to attachment to mind.
다디 인디 아니 균디는 아주 수도스디 딱지시나 야구요래 가리 딱지시나 야구요래스 라바이나 ngau nyamba yobache susola nga nyambe shemba yobache shemba yobadi ngazul susu gi nyongwe gul ke de korwa ta shemba di yena yang dinde gi shemba di ke de na nga se gi shemba di yede na yang nga la chagu ya mindus nga la machabe ka ya yung chosare seji sisare sisamare di shimju chi che reswa ta nga la shencha nga la shemba da nga la chakwa nga la shencha ye chosares nga la shencha yena ya nge laegi 아니 shencha di mayu wakap yung chosares sisare sisamare dinga zogi gyundingi susugi chowa nanglo to shimju cheda yung chosare chosamare susu tebayina 다가랑게 수수 땡키기래.
So one thing worth considering is or like checking for oneself is if you look or you kind of observe, do you feel that there are any moments where there is a conception of the self, which we call self-grasping, but it's not accompanied with attachment to this self? And so this is something worth doing frequently. So kind of just keeping it in mind and seeing in the course of one's life whether there are any moments where we feel that there is grasping at this self, but that is not necessarily accompanied with attachment to the self as well. So that's the first one. And the other thing that's worth checking is it possible that when there is attachment to the self, it does not necessarily have to lead to attachment to something that we see as mine? So the two things to test are whether we can conceive of or we feel or we experience a state of grasping at the self which is not accompanied here as if it was concomitant. It's where it's not which is inseparable or separable. That's what we're seeing with attachment to the self. And then is it possible for there to be attachment to the self, but that does not necessarily result in or spill over into an attachment to mind? And the more kind of you start looking at this or you start just testing for this, it becomes quite evident that it's not possible for this to be without the other.
수수기 풍보라 녜 lakwa 녜 lakwa 녜 go 녜 강바 녜 셈 세제다 녜 수수기 규기 마두바 이네 녜 강바 녜 디디 녜 잘라 녜 상말라 녜 세지 로 레디도 와 나이버 좀 지 레디도 와 먼저 로 hingel라 나이버 좀 끼 먼저 끼기도 와 So that Dindigi Ngayu Zimba di Ngam Zimba Cheche, Ngayu Zimbo, get the edge Yung Chosares. Reswa, Digi Gablo de la Nga se Zimbachi Deme Goba. And Ngayu Zimba doos get the edge Yung good to best. Reswa, Dijik Shimjuche.
And also one more thing to please check is ordinarily, very naturally, we always identify things as mine, where we naturally feel this is my body, this is my mind, these are my thoughts, these are my feelings. And so this kind of very innate way of identifying things as mine arises all the time, endlessly. The next thing to see is, does this thought does this thought of mine arise without being connected to or without resulting from conceiving of I or a conception of the self, or does it always have a preceding thought of I or of the self that then leads to a notion of mine? So that's another thing that one should really try and figure out and check.
Dene Gundengi Lola, Nye Labdesa, Ngai Sesagi, Sedesa Chasa, Dilla, and Dilla Chagwa Mindu, in a ding Nye Seg, Samu do, Dilla Ngai, Segayua Seg, Dilla Negi, Seg, Keja the Ligi to Timba the Ligi do de, in a Dilla Chagwa Mindu, Sesa, Chigragidur Mindicata.
And then the other thing to see is, when you identify something or when we identify something as mine, when we see something as mine, in those moments, are there any possible states where there is seeing or observing or conceiving of something as mine that is not accompanied with attachment to that? So the idea is, there are certain states where I conceive of things as mine, but I have no attachment towards them. So that's the other thing that one kind of has to make clear over here.
So the Shimji Chena, so the Shala Jalakarido, Chembasta, Nang Tambo, and Jalakari Karila, Negi, Seg, Dushi Kawaka, Kigidu, Mobut Sang, Dunachik Tram. And Tram Shaju, that you mobile a Dillangi, Dushi, Ngai, Dushiki, Telangi, Dushiki, Telangi, Dushiki dus. In a Dilla Chakwa Mindus, in a Ngai Dushiki dus. Seg Zuz, such Ragiduna, and a Shimji Yorta. Shimji Yorta. Ngayu Zimba Genaya, Tella, Chagomeva, Yung Chosares. The Yung Chona, and Ngazimbas, Nagi Dushi Lenaya, Ngala Chagomeva, Yung Chosares. That Dindej Zudusa Ragiminduna and Chivarua, Karshine. Tella Ngayu Zinsuna, Tella Chagome, Missiva Ragiminduna Sinshi, and Ngayu Zinsuna, Tella Chagwa Kachinki Gore. So the Ngayu Dushi Magana, and Chagwa got to him with the Hakona, Ngagi Dushimena, Ngala Chagwa Gami to what it think.
So for instance, when you're sitting in your room, just lay out a whole bunch of stuff that in front of you and see which one you have this thought of mine arise to, or which one of these things we conceive of as mine. And if you find that there are certain things that you identify or you conceive of as mine, and there are others to which there is such a conception does not arise, where you don't identify them as mine, then at that point ask and see whether, while you're identifying certain things as mine and other things that you don't identify as mine, but not thinking about it naturally, if naturally certain things you don't identify as mine and the ones you do identify as mine or belonging to you, are there any moments where, while identifying something as belonging to you, you don't have attachment to them? And if you find that there are certain moments when you identify it as mine or belonging to me, but you don't have attachment to them, then there is some room of what here the opponent is saying. If, however, every time you identify something as mine, that's always accompanied with a state of attachment, then naturally one asks or wonders, why is it that whenever there is a conception of mine, it's always accompanied with attachment for that thing that one identifies or conceives of as mine? If this starts becoming amply clear, and you start to feel that it is really like this, then it's easy to trace back the source of this attachment to a notion of an I that then spills over into mine, which is always accompanied with attachment. So then it's clear that as long as this thought of I, or as long as the conception of an I continues, it will lead to mine, which is always going to be accompanied with a state of attachment. That becomes quite evident.
다 녜세 두실립데서 용어보텔라 아니 차과 여바이나 텔라 차과 유나 아니 교연 가리요래 교연 가리요레슬라나 아니 교연디 딘디 용어보디 너와 나이와 진데서 용어보텔라 차과디 여바 손자 디기 교연 가리요레라나 아니 딘디 용어보텔라 아니 셴바지기 네버 중세지 제바이나 테마타 아니 심귤라 마시바게로레 셈라 이미데바게로레 셈라 이미데바 게도디 딘디기 이미데바 디기 아니 겐체제 아니 콘돌라도다 아니 마가와 게도다.
Okay, and so if that this first initial kind of thing is amply evident, then so what? So what if one has attachment to certain things? What's the issue? What's the problem with that? If you look again, while anyone has attachment to anything, the problem with this attachment is that if there is any harm or anything that intervenes or obstacles one's continued existence or one's continued enjoyment of that thing, then naturally that attachment gives rise to aversion towards whatever led to ending or intervening this kind of connection that one has made between the thing and oneself. And so this notion of mine, the problem with the attachment that accompanies it is that if anything was to take that away or harm that thing, it naturally gives rise to a sense of aversion, which then leads to mental and emotional discomfort. So that's the problem with it.
아니 심규 마시와 징예기 축체슈 누바체슈 서로와 축체슈 땡에디 아니 공도들이다.
And the thing or the emotional state that is most disturbing or that kind of imbalances and creates the most amount of discomfort is anger and aversion.
공도로 셈딩 나로라지 식버사데디 로아 다 디요나 가리요레스 람나 아운디 랑게들은 제케요입니다.
So this form of anger or aversion is like something that deep down inside you feel almost repulsed to something, no? Or you feel averse to something, and that kind of stirs something inside which is uncomfortable. If then someone says, so what? What's the problem with that? Then there's not much you can really do for someone who thinks like that.
오더 디기 당부 랑루기 가리 랑루기다 커지기 되봐 절람신도 좀 별로도 가발라 절람신도 셰바들라 디기 말레스 가르친 디기 말레스 미디비다 랑루기 당부 디숭기 포인트 디숭기였다.
So the first point that here Acharya Dharmakirti is making is when Acharya Dharmakirti is saying why it's not okay to assume that there can be a path that is not addressing attachment to a self or the view of self-grasping, this is the first point that he's making.
Then
the second, the inaccuracy of accepting a faultless self while considering meditating on the flaws of attachment to a self a path for liberation.
다도 짐불로기 신이 다텔라 세메 네바 메소나 녜바 메소나 아니 달라 착바디 다까투 요마레스 달라 착바 까마투나 다기월라 착바 까투고 마레스 마두스 라비용디 커지기 다도 짐비 신이 다 세메 네바 메나야 달라 착바 쩐쩐도 까투고 마레스 다마도 까마투고 다마도 까투고레스 당지기 신이 다 Neba mebare, sime neba mebare de, ina dala chakwa ka thugres. Kaya ki lamka yores, kaji ki yores. Yobe ina odi karires, sidi dala chakwa kyunjin do gomba di, 아니 달라 차비 착보 고제기 님보레스 가지기 딜랍다.
So the second view here is the notion of a self or conceiving of a self is not faulty because the self itself is faultless, it exists. But because you have attachment to the self, it leads to all of these subsequent problems. So the next view that is being brought up by someone over here is, okay, so it's not enough to think about the faults of mine or try and remove attachment to mine. What has to be worked on is the attachment to the self. But the self itself is faultless, it exists, it can't be harmed. Harmed over here means by reasoning or by valid cognition, it can't be harmed, and therefore you can't act on the self itself. And so the only thing left to do is acting upon the attachment to the self. And so here the view is, even though there is a self and that's faultless, there is still a path that can lead to liberation because you can act upon the attachment to the self.
Dire. Diindu kajigi da nyeme yinje dala shena korwa chingwe dala chagwa junjusu sampra chawu shenas.
And so here someone says, even though the self is faultless, if a self is conceived, one will be bound to samsara. Therefore, it is the faults of attachment to the self that are to be reflected on.
Da dala chagwa kayagi nyembu karire chagwa la gyön kari yores. Di samlo tanya deres dala chagwa lodi dala chagwa lodi la gyön mangbu shudus. Pyön da gyön da yönden gece şey korwa, pyön da nimi gece şey korwa, pyön da nimi gece şey yöndü dala chabi chagwa se tella 아니 평연다 님이 깨져 삼로땅 윤디 님이 첨부시라래샤스 꾼 첨부시라도스 디윤디 착별로디 코로 꾼레샤스지 삼로땅 샤바이나 아니 달라 착바디 본토그레스 어다 디수기여.
So what they're saying over here is when you have attachment to the self, how you can overcome this attachment to the self is by recognizing the faults of attachment. So just please pay attention where faults over here can mean two different things. It can mean disadvantages or demerits, and on the other hand, it just can mean that it exists. So over here, when they're saying, faults can mean it doesn't exist or disadvantages. And so here what the view is attachment to the self is the one that is faulty. You can reflect on the faults of it, which means you can reflect on the disadvantages of attachment to the self, because when you consider what the advantages as compared to the disadvantages are, and you look at the qualities of this attachment to the self, you will notice that there is an abundance of faults or disadvantages or demerits of this attachment, and therefore by reflecting on these faults, then you will be able to eradicate attachment to the self.
Sonza ranglugi kajila patiwa tangche. Kede chakba kyunjin yinba samlo tangba yinaya kari yores, tele kari kyurgires. Kede chakba kyunjin na tele chi gyurs. Ranglugi patiwa tang yindu kajigi debong gyurs. Chakba debong dugres. Ta chakba debong dugres tanda geje di chakba chungru dubi geja marda. Chakba zawan yini meba sotu gres. Dendigi kyunjin yinba samlo tangna chakba zawan yini ge meba sotu gres. Pang dugres.
So the first two lines is then Acharya Dharmakirti says, he says, so if attachment has these faults, what results from attachment having these faults? Or what results from attachment being known to have these faults? And the opponent says, it would be abandoned. Now here what they're saying is not that it'll reduce, they're saying that it'll go away. You can reflect on the faults of attachment and it goes away. So you can abandon them, remove them, eliminate them, uproot, eradicate. All of those are the synonyms, right? So here, if you reflect on the attachment of these, on the faults of this attachment, what will happen? The opponent here is saying you will be able to get rid of it entirely.
Da tela ranglugi te pong dugre slab yundu dala chakwa di pong dugre sidi ranglugi di pong tugu mares. Pong mituba di chakwa gi yu ani chakwa di gi kangla chaksa gi yu di meba so tugu mendu wa seja ani di yu sunju meba ni te pong wani nyuma is. To
which then the reply is, without refuting its object, that cannot be abandoned. So as long as that object is seen to exist, or that the object of that mind is not refuted, that mind cannot be abandoned. That's the reply that is being given. So the first reply is, without refuting the object of that attachment cannot be abandoned, that attachment cannot be eradicated.
Di indi ta kare dala chakba gyunju su gomgin tongde gengi gombe lo senanda tongde gengi lo di chujin che. Dindi digi dala chakba pong mitute dindi gi dala chakba digi shinyu da di lo digi shinyu di sun chung tugu mido was.
So is this clear? Take attachment to a self. It follows the mind that take attachment to the self. It follows reflecting on its faults cannot eradicate it because it is not refuting its object of engagement. Yeah? Okay?
Chujin kare?
What's the subject of this? No, I made a mistake.
Dala chakba gyunju su gombe lo di chujin.
So the mind that is reflecting on the faults of attachment, that's the subject.
Di lo di chujin che. Ani dala chakba pong mitute
it cannot remove it. It cannot remove attachment to the self. Is that okay? So the mind that is reflecting on the faults of attachment, it follows it cannot remove attachment.
Because
it does not refute the object of attachment to the self.
So the digare do you sunjung mebani tepong one in new minds. Kazanga or what's our wall ligres like Saudi did it.
The other day when we said that verse that is going to come ahead, which says, why without refuting its object you cannot eradicate that mind, this was that verse.
Oh, do you sunjung mebani tepong one in new minds? Ta ona lo tigi shinyu di sun machongba yina ani lo di pong tugu marves kyaba yorves na kyaba yores.
Then the thing is, again, is that clear? The mind that is reflecting on the faults of attachment, it follows it cannot abandon it, remove it, because it does not refute the object of that attachment. No. So then, is there pervasion in this reason? And the following section is explaining the pervasion for this.
Da kyaba di drubyungdu yönden gyöndan jedewe döda dangso pangwani teda yula matongwa yingi chisul kangi means.
So the remaining section is abandoning attachment and aversion that are connected with virtues and faults is from not seeing those in objects and not from external means.
Da yönden gyöndan jedewa sege ngobu chigla yönden jik tongche. Ngobu chigla yönden jik tongne chakbake. Chakbake ki yöna dende ki chakba di kabala ngobu di chakbake ki gyumsen rabu di ngobu di ki yönden tonga di ki chigi yoba yindi yönden di mindu seche. Kang ngobu chakba di ki tong di ki zin di ki shen di ki ngobu di ki yönden di meba ma tongi padu ani ngobu tela mibi chakba di ka togu ma res. Peti jikchi she. Daga na shin ki ngobo de la gyunji tong che shedang kiki yuna ani dindi ki shedang di ngobo de la gyun di meba ten la pang matu ki pardo ani ngobo tela mibi shedang di kagi mares. Di indi yönden tongwa da jesu dribi chakwa tang ngobo de la gyun tongwa da jesu dribi dangwa di pangyagi lamgada masono yoye di karire yönden ngobo teda tela yönden da gyön tini ngobo nisula meba di tenla pabore mato shenpa tabshi kangi kyang tela mibi chakwa da dangwa nigo di kaatogu mares.
So what these lines are saying is, abandoning attachment and aversion that are connected with virtues and faults, when attachment arises, the object of attachment, what attachment conceives, is it conceives certain virtues or it perceives certain virtues. Virtues here is like positive traits, right? It perceives certain positive qualities in an object. And then when it sees these positive qualities or these virtues, it wants to it wants that. Similarly, what aversion sees in the object is it sees faults. And so when there is attachment that is connected with seeing virtues in things or seeing benefit in things, and aversion that sees faults in things, so that's what it means when it says it's connected with virtues and faults. Attachment arises because it sees certain qualities as pleasurable or virtues. Aversion sees faults in the object. They are connected with seeing virtues and faults. To be able to get rid of this attachment and get rid of this aversion, it can only arise by realizing that those qualities don't exist. So is from not seeing, abandoning these, is from not seeing those in objects, which is seeing those here referring to virtues and faults. So when the objects of attachment and aversion are virtues and faults in objects, the only way to get rid of attachment and aversion is to realize that those qualities don't exist. There are no other means that can lead to getting rid of, abandoning, removing attachment and aversion. That's what it's saying over here.
Means oh yeah. Da di gyumzen tadungpa kaseru tang yundu cha yu tingi cha megi tyengi yundun tongwe yin ma chang megi tela ne dibu kange dobarchi.
So then to clarify this point even more, the next verse says, attachment is not from the virtues of attachment, it is from the virtues of things. What could reverse the effect when its cause is not incomplete?
Da deba nala da tup des. Da deli shembe tsu kangi ke pongi mares.
Ken deba tromas. Gang ka jitawe deba tromas.
Ale gangi deba de losha da. Kiran losha na.
So just the commentary for the earlier verse is cognition that sees the faults of attachment to a self cannot abandon attachment to the self because the conceived object of the attachment, which is a self, is not refuted. There is pervasion because abandoning attachment and aversion that are connected with virtues and faults happens by not seeing those virtues and faults in objects. Any other means other than these cannot abandon them. And then there's the next verse that is explaining why.
So that Yundian Kenda Jesu Drive Chakwa the Dangwa di Yugi Yundian the Kyen Teda Meba Tongaguni Pongiri Mado Shamba Tap Kangi Pongtugi Mare Sidu Kajigi Ta Matu des Ta Matu Slavaina Ta Tugires Ta Tubi Dujedi and Tada Sungi Chayu Dingi Chaming is the Sungi.
So when we say after giving that earlier reason, we've said any other means other than these cannot abandon them, which is the last line of the commentary, or the last line of the root verse, not from external means or not from other means. Here the reply by the person who has the view that there are other paths is saying that reason is not established. The reason that's not established for them is that there are no other means that can be used to abandon attachment. And so when they say reason not established, to reply to their objection is the next verse, which is attachment is not from virtues of attachment, it is from the virtues of things.
Da tupde dala chakwa de deba. Da tupde dala chakwa de rangi yundin tongwe dala chakwa mingi. Dagi yundin tongwe dala chakwa yinbe shirs.
And so the commentary says the reason is established, which reason that there are no other means, because attachment to a self is not because of seeing the virtues of attachment to a self, but because of seeing the virtues of the self does one have attachment to a self.
Da dus gongba shena da. Da dila chabi chakwa yor da ngan sangmala. Reswa. Dila chabi chakwa kigi yor ngan sangmala dil mi bi chakwa kigi yor chikap dila mo dil mi bi ro. Da dila chabi chakwa ki yungdu da ngan zo dila chabi chakwa ki yungdu chakwa di dila chabi chakwa tela chakwa la yundin du tongne dila chabi chakwa keba rebe kabgi yundin tongne ni chakwa di keba re. Tiwa dir.
So the question is, for instance, assume that everyone, all of you have attachment to this cup. When you all have attachment to this cup, does attachment to this cup arise from seeing the benefits of attachment or the virtues of attachment to this cup, or from seeing the virtues of the cup itself? That's the question.
Virtues like that. 윤대라고 그래. 어디? 어디?
Is that a better word for virtues? Qualities can be bad also, no? Is there an easier word?
Virtues is a good word.
Gen didn't like it. Yeah,
First
it's
one.
too long.
Okay, that was we will make
That's also too long. Attractiveness is just weird also. If you come with a better word, tell me after. Make do for now.
나도 네 진짜 참고 차서나 아니 야네 계기로 진짜 싸웠어.
Afterwards, then you all come up with your translation class. Learn translation.
손자다 딜을 차비 차고 디기 껍디기 연된 통이 차고 끼기로 마도 델라 차비 차고 루디기 연된 통이 차고 끼기 매발인디 아니 님부터 용디 디기 연된 통에 딜라 연된 통화 딜라 님부 가인 때마도 같이 디 연된이랑 자샤 다 딜라 차비 루디 껴레샤 삼로당 되나 차고 끼기 규디 쳔바지체 님부터 쳔바지체
So for instance, if what you have attachment to is the cup because you see certain virtues in the cup, but then what you cultivate as an antidote to the attachment that arises is not seeing the virtues of attachment, then the cause of attachment are the virtues that one sees in the object. The antidote that one applies is seeing the faults of the attachment towards that thing. So the cause of the attachment and what you're acting on, what the antidote is acting on, they become two unrelated things.
다 착과게 디 유기 연된 통이 착과 맞게 받체 착과로 연된도 통이 착과 끼기 연나 아니 계란길 라면 님부터 디기요. 다 착과 견주 검샤나 착과 빵 두그래는 디기요래. 이나야 착과 끼에 디 유기 연된 통이 끼기 여바 인데 유기 연된 통을 내가 가야 땅 두고 매바 손사 유디 연된 여바 tel은 내가 가야 땅 두고 메디 착바게 규디 여바래 디인디 마상 메주 텔라니 디부 관계 똑같이 있습니다.
So what over here, that last line, which is what could reverse the effect when its cause is not incomplete? It's saying if the cause of this attachment, which is seeing virtues in objects, is not incomplete, which means the causes are there because the thing has certain virtues. And then this gives rise to attachment. Until you see the faults with the thing or you remove the notion that this thing has virtues, you will not be able to get rid of attachment. If attachment was coming from seeing the virtues of attachment, of the mind that is attachment, then reflecting on the faults of attachment as a mind will be able to remove attachment, because the source of attachment is seeing virtues with attachment. But if the source of attachment is not seeing the virtues, seeing virtues with attachment itself, but with the object that attachment perceives, without removing those, attachment will keep coming. Which is why, how could you reverse the effect which is attachment when the cause for that attachment, which is seeing the virtues in things, is incomplete, is not incomplete, which means they're all there. How will you be able to get rid of attachment?
So that the method needs to yugi yunde yomari se jigda lodila ani kyun yore se method jigni to the method niga ngazu namju jigding soga yongda ngazu niga pyeje chigo orda.
So this method of seeing the faults in objects and seeing the faults in mental states, or which is like reactions, seeing the faults with the thing and seeing the faults with how we react to those things, are both methods that we commonly use also every day.
Pena pamadinderwa susugi pugu da labrador shimbe kabla da dindeji kabla jigna phazo da khalso ore jige da jigla chaje da pena dilan digirwa da budo phomu susu penju jigla chaje ani digita chaje do sko kangye jigal ruguyona 파마디기 당고 부구디 파주 강라 차서 유디기 견다기로 견 가르도 정말 지시자 아니 랍자게 베서 시기로 다 캐라 콜라디 자원 마치서 코딘디 독자 도 고 연된 통이 차되게 여봐인데 응을 견디 드시게 배전식으로 와. 소도 딩아주 메터드 비스 유스식이도 와.
For instance, when parents have children that go to school and they see that their kids are hanging around with bad company, which is then making them behave in ways that are not great, the kind of advice that parents give their children is knowing that the children like those other friends because they see them as nice or they see certain virtues in that. The advice that they give them is saying, hey, look, don't spend time with them, don't associate with them because they have these faults, these faults, these faults. So when they see that their children are drawn to that thing because they like it or because they see something nice there, then the advice that parents often give to their children is don't do it because it has such and such a fault. These are the problems with it, with the person itself. So that's recognizing the faults or reflecting on the faults of the thing as an antidote, which we commonly use.
다 봐줘 보고들라 그 룸마토나 파마되게 아니 봐줘되게 유득이 견시에 개매라 다 메두가라 다 그런 도시면은 두저털라쇼도 두저털라는 그런 경우라 그랬어요 아니 도시제 로기 견시에지 마도 다다 착비기 견시하면서 대대신이 그런 딘데 셈행네 대바이나 셈행바디기 그런 경 가래가라라 그래서 로기 견지시에 가야게 답시기도.
Whereas if then the friends are all actually really good and there's nothing wrong with them, but you see that your child is getting very caught up and very distracted and is spending all their time over there, then not being able to show that there's anything wrong with the friends that they have or the company that they're keeping, then the advice that you give them is don't get too involved, don't get too obsessed with it, don't get too attached or don't get too drawn, don't get too distracted by it, because if you get obsessive, if you get distracted, if you get too involved, then you will not be able to take time to do this, you will not be able to take time to do that, you will not be able to focus on your studies, you will not be able to do other things. And so without finding faults in an object, if the reaction to that object is creating problems, then parents tell the children or they tell their kids to start paying attention to the faults of getting too involved with something, so with the mind that is engaging with that object.
So
we do use both these methods very normally.
아니 착발라 균 통해도 가리인 바스 양게 뒤웠단 거래 차라 균 강시 통 동부 뒤웠단 말.
After this, then now Acharya Dharmakirti is further asking a question and saying, okay, so let's assume you say you see faults in attachment. What are these faults that you see with attachment? And so the question is also, what faults are seen in attachment?
다텔라 가지기 랭갸래. 걔들 동이 땡셔나스. 아니 착과 텔 동이기기도 와서 착과디 동이기 땡치기도 와서 동이기 유치기도 와서.
And then they reply and they say, attachment leads to suffering. So it is a support for suffering. It is what suffering arises out of. So the reply is, it's a support for suffering. That's the fault with attachment. It is a support of suffering. So this, if you say it is a support of suffering,
대땅스 랍디칸라 착과 동이기 땡임바 땡 제바 이나요. 착과도 동이기 땡 제바체. 착과 동이기 땡임바 통바 이나양스. 이나양 착과 텔라 대두고 말레스. 딜리 착디 means 달라 착과 대다 카테두고 말레스.
Even then, there will be no freedom from attachment to it because it is seen as mine, just like a self. Says, if that is the case, then you will not be able to remove attachment to it, attachment now to attachment itself. Seeing the faults of attachment will not lead to you being able to remove attachment to attachment itself, because you are seeing that attachment as mine, just in the same way that you see a self.
다 당부디 지구질 삼았단다. 달라 차고도 동이기 땐도 토나양 아니 대다 카테두고 민두스 대다 카테두고 말레스 대다 차고도 제법 민세시. 다디 랍용도 야 기란도 심주체다. 수수익이 로칸다 칸라 괜히 뭐 통바체. 이내양 타동 아니 lodi kama to bacheje lodi kama to bacheje ko karso warta lodi kyun ba thongwa digi khola karda sinista ma gonne ma to ba ngajo namji nyongjur ki sowa nala dindi yeme suzu shimju she
So just test for yourself if ordinarily in one's own life you experience or you've noticed that when you have a mental or like you have a reaction to something which is not favorable or you don't like your reaction to it, if by reflecting on the faults of your reaction, which is essentially a mind that is reacting to something, if you think about the faults of that mind, is that enough to prevent that mind from coming up or not? Just see that, like in your ordinary life, if that is something that you've experienced, that you realize that there is a mental state that is harmful, and then reflecting on the faults of that mental state is able to prevent that state or that reaction from arising or not. Just see if that's like, test and see whether that works.
Right? Ta tanda de ranglu gita jumju so kharshi grislamna chakwa di dunge dala tang ngegyula chakwa yobche ngegyula chakwa yore dendegi chakwa di dunge gi tenshi du sede khazume go khazue chakwa di dunge tenshi ba thona yang di chakwa di da khathe tu mares khathe me du gimzen kharela chakwa de la ngayu bizim lo ki du was chakwa de la ngayu wa sege samlu di ki du was nge sege dushi di li du was.
So, what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying here is, when you have attachment to mind that arises, or to something that you see as yours, that belongs to you, when you have attachment that arises, seeing this attachment as a source of one's suffering, or seeing that this attachment is a cause of suffering, is not going to be able to counter this attachment, because this attachment itself is seen as something that belongs to me, is seen as mine. So if you see the attachment as creating suffering, however much you might do that, you will not be able to counter it, because this attachment is still seen as mine. That's what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying.
So that susu gyugi lo dungi gi tenshi dingi lo khandi chi yimba yina ya tendi gi lo thela nge se gi dushe ngai se gi dushe di yona ani tendi gi lo thela tendi gi lo ti khathe tuk mares di lo ti suso da khathe tuk mares meba tuk mare kajilana thela ngai se gi jimba di yudi simdi ji yorta leso pena digi ngala dungi gi tenchi gi yobashe digi ngala dungi gi tenchi gi yoba digi ngala dungi tigi yoba yina yang nigi sem nigi di ngei seje zinde na di tu nam gi che yang ngada khathe tung mare.
So basically what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying is, as long as even if something is causing difficulty or causing suffering or discomfort, as long as that thing is seen as something that belongs to me, or one sees it as mine, despite it being a source of my suffering, my seeing it as mine itself will make it difficult or impossible for me to be separated from it. I will continue to hold on to it. Naturally, I'll continue to be connected with it, grasp at it, this mind itself. For instance, if this mic is creating problems for me, as long as I keep identifying it as mine or something that belongs to me, irrespective of whether it is a cause of my suffering, I will not be able to be separated from it. My mind will keep associating with it, just because of identifying it as mine.
Yeah.
But that means there is no hope for any transformation, because everything is mine.
Everything is not mine. Mara, everything is mine.
Everything is not mine.
Well, this body is mine, my emotions are mine, my feelings are mine, my thoughts are mine. So I can't transform them because they're mine.
Kyubat nang tugur wa kajilana mine leg ai di mindulan khasang ngadu shi kya derwa.
there's no I. How can it be mine? That's how you can transform it. That's the whole point of this whole thing.
디신 담에 곰 라디.
That's why they're saying reflect on selflessness, because there's no self. If there's no self, there can be no mind.
Yes, okay, but we have conventional antidotes. Patience for anger, right?
Ngajun namgyu jiktengi nyempo chetanji yo marwes control asoba gom.
열. 디즈 상만 다 요바 시작은 곰고리.
Yeah, but those are all based on the notion of a self. So they're not antidotes.
The paracetamol antidotes.
Huh?
The paracetamol antidotes.
Oh, yeah, that's what.
다 간다 다 메버 곰예기.
That's no.
다 메버 곰예기. 뉴버메나 안 다가나레 딜라고 차이메. 다 셴바 탑시 가린 체.
So if you can't address the notion of a self, then you have to do what you're saying. There's no other alternative.
But the path tells us to do both, right? Temporarily that and aiming at the big thing.
lam niga chechugudu mendoes. lam gomi ondu niga di chegores laguduas.
니가 최고를 라이디 림바 진이 제인데 다음에 곰마투비 가도 림바 두스 쪽으로 봐. 림바 두스 쪽으로 봐. 다 다음에 곰 투사나 아니 다음에 곰 투기라 다도 우주기야지 나요 녜요 이나야 아니 디 니미탄 되기라나 아니 유명메로 디다 lum부로 차고.
So where it says do both is that's a precursor to understand selflessness. Once you've understood selflessness, then to say it is not good for me, it is bad for me because it has problems is kind of almost daft. Because if you realize that there's no self, then forcing an idea of this is mine but it creates problems for me is irrelevant. So once you've understood that there is no self, returning to these other palliative care type of treatments which you're saying, which are all these other methods, doesn't make any sense. No one does that. So when it says you should practice them on the path, it's to be able to get to selflessness until you get there, not afterwards.
단다 개세신부 시발레기 야라디다 탐진의 투비 셰럽 튠두 송스 다간다 다음에 또비 따와디 게투에기 비준 셰체도 람기 림바디 송 와니 야 냠린 체기 림바디 송 디게기 체들다 디마게기 포도 림바디 드로고 두신 가신 탑이 신바 요 말다 다음에 마도 신제기라 아니 디 레가 두가디 디체바이나 경요바도 디치나 평요바도 삼로 땅제 덴데 시간에 또 스토규르 뭐 탑시 심바 가야요 말. 다른 심바도 지야 신지 다음에가 랩사나 다음에기 따와 또 사나 다음에 별로디 또 사소나 가서 다음에 또 어째 다음에 따와 귤이 깨사소나 다 디갈 대고마도 다마 밥체 영가만한 신기 람디 곰데 조고 말해. 평님이 삼모단에 완 줘야 조고 말해.
So if you remember, the opening line of the 9th chapter of the Bodhisattva Charyavatara says, all of these were taught for the sake of wisdom. All the stuff that is explained before, that is cultivated through these are the faults, these are the benefits, this is detrimental, this is beneficial, and this is to be abandoned and this is to be adopted, is all as a kind of preparation for being able to realize selflessness. Once one has understood selflessness and the wisdom of selflessness has arisen, returning to those earlier ways of practicing antidotes by saying this has faults, this has benefits, is insignificant. It has no worth anymore. Once you've understood selflessness, then that's all you cultivate.
다 강바디나나 탁바체 탁바딜로 둘통 아니 샤난게 딩이 미디 다 둘디 매바 마통게 버도 아니 미딩 샤난 슈게 되는 탑시 찍마도 요마고 강바 샤만을 치에레 다 그냥 시하고 말 디나데 디나를 둘민도 와서 라에 디마도 요마다 다 파게 탁바딜로 둘 매바 통사나 둘 매바 통상이 메델라 다 샤난디 매바 수에시도 양결 강바 샤만을 친 베준디 시하고 말다 둘 매바 통사바인데 대가란 게 샤난디 까기를 마도 양결 코 샤난디 까야시도 그냥 시하고 말은 가도와 라고 말이 가지는 둘 매바 통사로 와.
For instance, someone who sees a snake, walks into a room, sees a rope, there's a rope that's they see as a snake. Because they're so afraid, the only option you have is to take them somewhere else and say, stay here, there's no snake. For someone who in that room sees that there is no snake, then you don't need to say, oh no, don't worry, I'll take you elsewhere. Nor do you need to say, don't worry, I'm here, I'll protect you. The fact that they know it's not there has led to freedom from suffering. So they don't need that anymore.
다 dire 다 투사 가투래. 투사 찍래 다 여다 메시게제들. 다 여나 아니 단다 콘 모란 라오나 시레 아니 다 여바이나 달라 차비 차바 까투에 메레 달라 차비 차바 까투에 메바 인디 다기 월레 차비 차바 까투에 메레 다기 월레 차비 차바 까투에 메바 인디 아니 단다기 프로세스 타가랑 도디기레 디 도디기 여바 인디 둥엘레 타레 요 마레 둥엘 타레 메바디 ngo빈디 차르다.
So that's, if you can kind of like what you said, if you want to summarize it, that's exactly what's being said here, which is, if there is a self, then you can't do anything about it. Therefore, if there is a self, you will have attachment to the self. If you have attachment to the self, you will have attachment to mind. If you have attachment to mind, then the only option you have left is doing this, which is, this is beneficial for me, this is harmful for me, I should abstain from this, I should cultivate this. However much you do this though, you will never be able to entirely be of suffering, be freed from suffering, and so the natural state will be one of suffering. So the whole point of this entire discussion is, if there is a self or not. If there is no self, then all of this can be stopped. If there is a self, then like you said, that's the only option you have left. Then you have to do those things.
다 self yobache 아니 탑시 샴바디 제바디 temporary 마도 땡도 둥일 시바체 메바 인디 아니 타르바세디 요 마레.
So if there is a self, then all these things that you do will also only be temporary respite, which then means actually you cannot be free from suffering other than have temporary relief. Which is why then there will be no suffering. Liberation. Liberation becomes impossible at that point. If there is no liberation and one cannot attain liberation, then the only option is to do things that temporarily reduce suffering, which then means what we on earth as humans are doing is absolutely correct, because we're applying means to lead to temporary relief. So our way of behaving is accurate then. So like money, fame, popularity, all of these become worthwhile pursuits because they do lead to temporary relief. They do alleviate suffering for some time. So then they become valid methods.
So that di sama tuksa di odirta. That di tanda semnala that di da yoda me susu tenla paverda. Sangigi da meba song yorde di jesu meba di maybe dubje she shayore chirobagi da yoba she yore yobe dubje she shayore da di yoda me susu tenla paver. Susu gi tenla paver.
So the Buddha said there is no self. The non-Buddhists say there is a self. Now whether there is a self or not, that's up to you to figure out.
Dire tenla paver diche yoda me said. Da ine kari sewu hako gorelana da yona tendu dungi shiye mebadi accept che gore. And da meba ina tendu dungi shiye yobadi oti accept che to baji chungba ina nenga di shemba ina and digi yerda.
So whether there is a self or not, that's something that we individually have to test and see whether it is like that. But what's important over here, or what is essential to have clear, is if there is a self, then it's impossible to be freed from suffering. If there is no self, then definitive freedom from suffering is possible. If this much can be understood, that's good. Then whether there is a self or not, that's one's own kind of, we have to figure that out.
Da tanda de pandin chodagi chiroba ka de. Kaji ka gorlana khogi da yena yang ani dungele thwe thuguri dos. Dungele Tue Tugu Dus Kashina Dungele Tue Lamga Du Ladi, Oti Lamga di Mindus, Ye Lamga Du Ladi, Lamga di Takta Chegi Mindus, Nuji Tangor, Din Nuji Dangazo Tongorta.
So what Acharya Dharmakirti here is saying is, he's addressing or opposing the view that there can be a self, and along with that self being there, there can be a path that leads to freedom from suffering. So this is what Acharya Dharmakirti is doing. He's saying, as long as there is a self, there can be no path that leads to freedom from suffering. Whatever options or alternatives are being suggested by other views are all being refuted. So that's what we need to see. We need to see whether, if while accepting a self, there are other techniques or methods that can be employed that lead to freedom, like eradication of suffering. That's what we have to see. That's what he's trying to do.
Ta di gaide ninga chadu ta da yena ya ani da yena ya dala chakba di ka thugre ani dala chakba di ka thugre di kaya gi da meba mathona ya di ka thugre dala chakba ka thugre kaya gi lam dendi yore skeje shede ba di kharchini di kaya di kharchini khe chombo chago la na di gun norba di shego ta gun norba di shegi yoba yindi gun nona tele dribu yungya mebadi ngubin nizu chagar.
The reason why this becomes particularly significant is because while saying that there is a self, if attachment to the self is seen as creating problems, but while believing that the self is there or letting that remain untouched, if one tries to cultivate means or techniques to remove attachment to the self while leaving the self unharmed, so to speak, what Acharya Dharmakirti is saying is all of these attempts at addressing attachment to the self without touching the self are erroneous causes, they're mistaken causes. It's a mistaken identification of causes. And the nature of things is that if the cause is mistaken, the result that arises from that cause is also going to be a result that was not expected. And so with a misunderstanding of a cause or an inaccurate cause, a result that is consistent with what expects, that cannot arise. That's just how things are. So why it's important here is because it's addressing the cause that leads to liberation and saying this is not an accurate cause.
Tai kenanzu shimju kharicha warsana, tanda de shimju sawadi. Dila digi ngala dungi jik dingi yobadi soso gi she. Yina yang tadung dila ngi segi zimba dilo tang matu bacheje ngai segi zimba di mutun de digi yona ani di soso da kha tetab du mindu odi gongba she awta.
So the thing that we are actually now to check is, for instance, if this cup is creating suffering, is causing suffering, the question is, as long as it is identified as mine, or we think of it as belonging to me, is it possible to remove suffering with respect to that cup or not?
Odi shimjuche. Ta di ngubo tela ngi segi zimba di kogi dungi tonga digi ngi segi zimba di hloi tugu mindu na ani dindigi ngobo tela mibi chakwa di kate tugu maare. Ngobo tela kate tugu maare es. Di indu keran chakwa kazu mengo kazu chakwa gyunjin yinba gomba yinaya chakwa tela ngi lo segi zimba di yona dindigi chakwa di kerangi shigyu da kate tugu maare es. Da gyumzen dirdi.
So what the reason that Acharya Dharmakirti is giving here is, if while something is causing suffering, you continue to identify that as mine, you can try and do whatever you want, you will not be able to remove the suffering that is associated with that thing. So here, how he's explaining that with respect to attachment is, if you see that attachment to the self causes problems, you may reflect on the faults of this attachment as long as you want by recognizing that it is a cause of suffering, that it is making it difficult, it is creating discomfort, it is problematic. But as long as you identify that attachment as my mind or as pertaining to me, you will not be able to get rid of it.
다 내가 나신 디송기 여러분 다 단대 차라 소소 nga 세저와 단대 차라 당기 빼나 달라 착바디기 교연 가도 슬라바이나 달라 착바디기 교연디 둥이 딩기도스 착바디기 둥이 딩기도스 라바나시 다 당당 아주 또 스케치 셰윤데 다게야 둥이 딩고로 소소기 소소로 둥이 먹고 딩고로다 소소기 소소로 둥이 먹고 딩고르데 둥이 잼바야 하고고르데 소소도 누리셔도 다디디 나랑 랑기 쳐서 디 강엔디다 나랑 랑기 쳐서 쓰던 아주 소소기 미세 얌용날던데 먹고 윤구요르데 이나야 소소소소 카트에 되바 삼로 술는 리기모 nga meba soege samlo surna ligi midwa karchin lana dela dadu zimba di ledigdwa del dadu zimba di yoba meba sodugo meba indu ani dagarang mutune nga se dela chakwa mutuni kedigdwa.
So for example, the example that it says just like the self is saying despite the so we've seen that attachment is creating problems, but as long as it's identified as mine, one cannot be separated from it. And so, without being separated from it, identified as mine, one will not be able to get rid of all the problems that arise from it. Similarly, not only do we see that attachment creates suffering, but we also see that we are a source of problems. For instance, many times we identify or we see that I have caused this problem. I have made a mistake. I have been the source of my own suffering. Like, I am the cause of my own suffering. Despite that, and despite clearly on many occasions seeing that I myself am causing my own suffering or causing difficulties for myself, I am not seeing this itself is not sufficient for me to be separated from this self. Because I am still identifying or I am still conceiving of that self being there. So conceiving of that self being there, even though that self may be seen to be faulty because it's causing difficulties, problems, my own suffering, as long as it is conceived of as a self, it's not going to, one is not being able to be freed from that. So that's how the example is working. Which is why it says, even though there will be no freedom from attachment to it because it is seen as mine and then just like a self.
Deba dala chakwa dungi gi tendu tonaya tesam gi chakwa teda chewa mimba thal kangsa te chakwa tela ngai lo she dagi wa tonga yebe chers pena da dungil gi ten yin ya tela da do tongwe da pong minu ba shinos.
So the commentary says, even if attachment to a self is seen as a support of suffering, just seeing it as a support for suffering will not lead to freedom from that attachment, because the person thinks that attachment is my mind and considers it mine. For example, even though the self is a support of suffering, seeing it as a self is unable to lead to freedom from that self.
Ta tela kajigi kari lenkyo barela na tanda ranglu peji songrwa peji pe kari songre da dungi gi ten yin ya ani da dungi gi ten yin ba yin ya da dungi gi ten to thona ya da du da khoro meba di ten la pham ma thu ka la da du shemba di ka thu mare ani tu stegi re sa na peji ko ro wa ta pe tela khaji khala re ani khaji gi pe di thugi mindus khaji la na da di dungi gi ten re mindus da dungi gi ten re mindus kimjen khaji la na da la chakpa pang changye ge da dajumba slagorwa a koransoy dajumba shegorwa deyinde dala chakma mebetse ani trewe da yere sodan didi dungi gi mindu hastinde da de dungi gi ten re mindu stilengyombar.
So the example was, seeing attachment as a support for suffering is not sufficient to remove grasping at that attachment, because it's still seen as mine. Seeing a self as a support for suffering is not unable to remove grasping to it because it is still seen as a self. Here the objection is, your example is not valid because when you see a self, it's not true that you will necessarily have attachment or grasping at that self, attachment to that self, because there are states of liberation, because they also speak of liberation. So they speak of beings that have attained liberation, because there are beings that have been liberated or have attained liberation who no longer suffer, they no longer have attachment, but they have a self. And so because there is a liberated self that does not lead to attachment, your example is not right that as long as you see a self, you will have attachment to the self. Because there are states of liberated selves that when you see them, they don't lead to attachment.
다 니카지기 자와카레 게데 데메 다 동일 규민스.
So they said, if that did not exist, the self would not be the cause of suffering.
데바 다 동일기 규민데 다라 착바 메베스 트웨 다 임비 치르셰나스.
So the commentary clarifies that by saying, if one says the self is not the cause of suffering, because when there is no attachment to the self, it is the liberated self.
다 딜라바이나 아니 직바레스 아니 다기와양 둥이 때 마임 바차도 그레스 케랑게 탄다 줌진 셰당 데나진 셰바이나 다기와양 둥이 마임 바탈스 다 철베세 다디 둥이 때 미셰바나시 다기와양 아니 다디 초바톱도 다기와양 둥이 때 치마르와스 직바르와스 세제 아니 대양 테다다스.
So in response to this view, Acharya Dharmakirti says that will also be similar. Because in the same way that you say there is a fault, the self, when it is liberated, they will not give rise to attachment, then even mine or things that belong to the self, they will also be faultless, because when you have a liberated self, you will equally have things that are mine or that belong to that self that will not give rise to attachment. So then your idea that the problems are with things that you identify as mine or things that belong to the self, that is also inaccurate, because you have a liberated version of that as well.
다 제바 다기와 태양 둥이기 규민바 다 대단 자와 임바탈 다기와라 착바 메베세 트웨 다신 다기와 규미 임비시스.
So the commentary says, it would follow that even that mine is not a cause of suffering, just like that self, because when there is no attachment to mine, just like the liberated self, even mine is faultless.
다 대다른 니가 괴메바 디지니를 찾으면서 다 계랑이 셰단 디나신 집이나 나도 다기와 니가 괴메바 차서 대다른 니가 괴메나 금진 디 니가를 찾고 대처 시기마 달라 찾고 대처 시기마를 다기를 찾고 대처 시기마레스 다 자와디 수비어.
So then in the next root verse says, in this way, or because of this, because both would be faultless, there would be no freedom from attachment to both.
제바 대다르 다다 다기와 니 둥이기 때 민바르 꿰메바 임바 디시르 니가라 착바 태자 민바 유로스.
Therefore, since both the self and mine are not a support of suffering and are faultless, there can be no freedom from attachment to both of them.
디레 소자다 다탄다 디기 커지기 다탄다 무튜니 양결 용거레 이내 다탄다 디 subject 디 나로라 커지기 착바 균진도 공바 디기 아니 착바 빵투그레세 디 딱다 디기 민두세 다 디디시 개기 요레 다 디인디 딩아조 인지미지 심주시오 그래.
So this discussion carries on in the text, and we'll address it as it comes. But the thing over here that needs to be checked, or one needs to see and test, is whether it is possible to remove attachment by reflecting on its faults or by identifying its shortcomings.
어디세? 다 매바체 아니 달라 착바디 다 매바이나 달라 착바 땡두 세요레스 디땡케바체 땡두 세버체발라 다 매바 통로 디마도 탑시요 마레스 람셴바 카리 곰바이나야 디메바 소투고 마레스 디 다 낭바상기비기 줍자 유에네메나 디레 유에네메나 디리다.
So the Buddhist position that is kind of the final or the main point or the main position of the Buddhists is, as long as you have a notion of the self, or as long as you conceive of a self, it is necessary that you will always have attachment to the self, and you cannot get rid of attachment to the self, come what may. So like the real heart of the Buddhist position, or the final most important Buddhist position is, as long as you conceive of a self, there will always necessarily be attachment to a self.
Tadi nangba sangibege kor uzugen dubdeba mayimba. Ta dodang gyuden dibugi namshak dodang digi toni. Ngobi nisula da yona an dosa dimadu mindus se yugi ngobi nisugi gyuden dibugi namshagani ditena papki yorda.
And this kind of position is not just something that they've invented, but what they're trying to do, or how they're trying to understand it, how they have understood it, is by looking at the causal process of how, when there is such a conception, or when there is such a form of conceiving of a self, the results are of this kind. When these results arise, they have to come from such a cause. And so looking at the causal way, look at how things causally exist, is how the Buddhists are trying to understand, and therefore eventually conclude that as long as you conceive of a self, there will have to be suffering.
Naza ringi tuwa, naza chik chaya meyo, ko naza di posona, tako chaya zani meba, kandar, chaya meba sam keja mayemba, tash bed koro shiju ta chwengi soda wajigi, ngazu gensir naza se chikdang, ya naza rik chik chaya yodeba. Mejo chena singda doya yodeba, naza de chaya yore se degi naza nituwa. So tam mejo che yungdu, nigal mejo chigido ngazo. Gensir na dingen sola ngazo mejo chigo orwa. Yine mejo chingi doctor koragi lagida, chaya yo mardas, yine mejo chigo lagido. Chigido miso rugudo da.
So even with us, there's two kinds of sicknesses that we have, or illnesses. One is like a terminal illness, like stage 4 cancer. And then there are other illnesses that are not terminal and they can be cured. But in both cases, there is treatment for both. So while you have stage 4 cancer and it's not curable anymore, there are still doctors that give you treatment, that you still undergo some medication. You do have a treatment protocol, but the doctor makes it amply clear that it's never going to get fixed. Whereas then there's another kind of treatment where there is, the final aim is to get fixed. So we have normally also two different kinds of illnesses.
Da keba kare thonga dula na neba nibu dil keba kare thonga dil ni kerazo shimju sheda. Warala thowa dinde chongso. Da neba nibu dil chaya yodingi naza di meju chedinge de da cancer po dinge midi meju chedinge nibu dila semba maki wa shudwa. Keba shudo kuni parola. Chik meju chedinge de sembi surdi nanglo la rewa dan, hob dan, gawa dan niga changde yu meju chidu. Chik de la da chaya meba digi. Da chik chedega chega chik drodega cheri mado da. Ya dugin ma dugin kari chigin da chik chedega cheri mado kunjo semba ding nanglo gawa di minduwa. Meju chiga doyin sem nanglo gawa di minduwa kajilan rewa di minduwa. Rewa mewa digi gawa minduwa. Gawa mewa digi di meju chedingi midu semba shu duguduwa. Di keranzo simju cheda hakuwa.
So to see, like observe, because I think I have seen this, that the difference between these two people, both of them are both suffering, they're undeniably both suffering. But the difference between these two people is the one who has a terminal illness, when they go and they receive treatment or they kind of do whatever protocol they have to do, or they're getting treated, unlike the ones who don't have a terminal illness and they are suffering and they are getting treated, the difference between the two seems to be that the ones who are getting treated who do not have a terminal illness, while they are undergoing this treatment, there's a certain amount of joy because there's hope that they have that something can get better. So because they have hope, or they see kind of a possible getting better, yeah, like cure, or they see a cure for their condition and they see that they can get better, there's a certain hope that they have. The other ones, even though they may have to go and receive chemo or whatever treatment they have, even though they're doing that, deep down inside, knowing that it's not curable, and therefore are not having any hope to get better, while they are suffering and while they are undergoing treatment like the other person, one marked difference between these two is that their minds are always a lot sadder, or they're a lot more burdened by their situation because they have no hope of getting better.
So that din never dinde nazaniga yuding never dinde that ngaransa le yunge that the shabdin la le orda so the ligi yudu ani naza chaya yuding midi jamju sugar le in the college lana that koran nadia naza digi koran shigi meodo ko hakugo ora di shiegi naza di member chaya yob naza di naza di shigi meo hakugo yob indi shigire se ngamra di gas mebashe ine ta ko process chik drogu yob di di sunang road mod shaba ding de la ko semba de test di yob indi nga de de meje shiga drogu ye ani menam jara sha sai de semba di dongba di zumu me do ji ta shemba naza yo ningi di le yong de dongbora ma che danga shingi drogu mindu ta dikora jigu la digdo ta khacho gore nga shingi drogu mindu sulane direwa jegdo.
So for instance, I've had people who've come, both kinds of patients, and they're coming to ask for prayers essentially. But the difference between the two, the way they are, is the ones who know that they're going to get better, like they know that their disease or their illness is not terminal, they know that they will get better, but they just kind of have to undergo this uncomfortable process of getting treated. But because they know deep down inside that they are going to get better, their expression, there's a little bit of joy, there is a little bit of like, they're not completely burdened or saddened. And the way they ask for prayers is they say, I'm going to go get treated, please do some prayers so that it works. The other kind of person who has no hope, when they come and they are essentially doing the same thing by asking for prayers, what they say naturally is, I don't want to die, what do I do? There's a big difference in how both of them react.
So the tanganzo deshala treatment chigor tanganzo sama. Ta chidi cancer never nashi treatment chigi naza thai yo midi treatment chewa nashi chigi tinganzo tha jo.
So the treatment that we're all kind of looking for is with relation to attachment. That's the treatment that we're seeking, the way to cure attachment. Our attitude is going to be either that of attachment being a terminal disease the way cancer is, and react or approach it like that, or we're going to approach attachment by seeing it is not terminal and it can be cured, and approach it with that way, approach the treatment in that way. So those are the two ways in which we will naturally approach this. Yeah, we stop.